Some of you might have been here for the last talk that I gave, which focused on 1774. I did a theme of global context of the American Revolution, the coming of the American Revolution. I began in Bengal. I talked about indigenous Americans and people of African descent. And the revolution took a long time. So if we're going to commemorate every year, you're going to get a lot of this year in revolution. Try to come up with different ways of thinking about it. So when I was asked to do this another year, rather than give you a tedious day-by-day account or re-articulate the causes of the American Revolution, I thought I would focus on a topic. Last time I talked about the global approach. And so what I'd like to do tonight is to talk about 1775 as from the way that people who lived through this event would have understood it as a year of internal civil war amongst British North Americans. And that's going to be the theme that I'm going to take a look at here. And I used the subtitle from some of the Keene town meeting notes. They didn't characterize it as a glorious revolution or something wonderful. They called it unhappy disputes that are now subsisting between Great Britain and the American colonies. So I thought maybe I'll take a look at how people experienced it as it unfolded and to try to pry us away from thinking about, we all know what happened. That's the thing that ruins history. We know what happened. The people who were living through it, they had no idea what was going to happen next. They didn't know what was going to happen a year from now. I think we're all familiar with this feeling ourselves. Future historians will look at us and say, well, why couldn't they figure out that we were headed in this direction? It's not clear to people what direction we're headed in. So what I'm going to do is just give us a kind of conceptual overview of how people experience this. I can talk about particular things. I'm happy to answer questions. I don't want to keep you here all night as well either. And I apologize in advance. And the last time I used an image and kind of began and ended with an image, but I packed this in with lots of text. This shows you how old I am. I like the written word. So you don't have to read through. I reproduced a lot of primary source documents. Hopefully it'll be available that people can look through. And what I'm going to try to do is connect the larger events in the Atlantic world with what was going on, not just in the Monadnock region, but in the province of New Hampshire itself. So this is a brief timeline of the year that we're looking at. I always see a connection to the previous year and then the year that's going forward. Just so you're aware, I won't go through all of the arguments that led to the American Revolution, although I will allude to some of the politics of it. Last time I talked about the destruction of the British East Indies Company in Boston and how that led to a political conflict. Parliament passed in March through June a series of laws responding to the destruction of the tea, known as the Coercive Acts. One of those coercive acts was the Quebec Act, which I'll just throw that out there. People are probably not fans of the Quebec Act or have ever heard of it before. But the province of Quebec was enlarged, and it was understood as one of these coercive acts. Some of you may be familiar with the Proclamation of 1763, which came out of Pontiac's War, which created an indigenous reserve within the British Empire, that British colonists were not supposed to colonize west of the Appalachian Mountains. The reason I mention this, because I will return to it in 1775, Quebec's boundaries were enlarged to include parts of the Trans-Allegheny West. So when people are thinking about Canada, they're also thinking about independent indigenous people in their lands. So that occurred in March through June of 1774. In September of 1774, the First Continental Congress was convened, not to prepare for war. Nobody wanted war. The idea was, let's coordinate political resistance to these coercive acts, or as they were called in North America, the Intolerable Acts. I'll talk about this in the presentation. In September, they approve Articles of Association, and it is a very, very tense time. Some people are willing to take that oath of association, not to import and export goods outside of the colonies back and forth to Britain. Other people are not. And there is a very difficult period in the early part of 1775 where Britain is starting to imagine we've got an insurgency on our hands, that this is a rebellion that's threatening to blow up into an insurgency. And they make some plans War breaks out, as we know, Patriots Day, April 19th, 1775. Everybody sees that as the sort of inevitable beginning of it, but people didn't experience that as such as it happened. It wasn't clear what was going to happen in the future. And just to contextualize that a little bit, shooting had broken out between North American colonists and British regulars as early as 1765 in the Trans-Allegheny West in western Pennsylvania, where vigilante groups of militia besieged a British post in the Trans-Allegheny West. And in my 1774 talk, I talked about how New Hampshire militia took the fort in Portsmouth, William and Mary. So we now understand that this is the beginning of the American Revolution, but people didn't understand it that way. As we just saw in the movie, in April 22nd, that march concludes. The local Keene and other town militias muster here and then march down to Massachusetts. And shortly after that, the Second Continental Congress convenes. The governor dissolves the assembly, sends them home, and New Hampshire convenes an extra legal provincial Congress right around the same time. So it's a very tense time. And what's not often known, and I'll kind of end with this, in July of 1775, Congress authorizes the Olive Branch petition to the king. So what we understand as a war, people in the Continental Congress, this is an interesting question. Why are they petitioning the king? They're asking the king to solve the problem. And I'll tell you how that goes. And this might be well known to you as fans of New Hampshire history, and you may know this. Governor Wentworth was the last royal governor of New Hampshire. He later becomes the royal governor of Nova Scotia, surveyor of His Majesty's Woods. He flees the colony on a British warship in August of 1775 with his closest supporters. Others have to make their own way to get out. So there is a very strange period in New Hampshire where there is no official government. So this creates a lot of anxiety, and it's not clear what's going on. And in January of 1776, the following year, and this is what I will end on tonight, the Exeter Provincial Congress, which I'll talk about, they write and approve the first New Hampshire Constitution. And so that will be what I end on, is New Hampshire is actually the first colony to become independent and effectively secede from the British Empire. That didn't happen until 1776. So my central argument tonight is you can't understand this fully as a war for independence. A lot of people make the analogy between the situation in the American Civil War and the American Revolution. In fact, a lot of Confederates said this is the Second American Revolution. It was actually a little bit different. Those Confederate states seceded pretty quickly from the Union. They created an independent country in pretty short order, and then other states seceded as well. What I want to focus on tonight, in 1775, nobody had seceded from the British Empire. Nobody was making that case. Now, some people might have been thinking about it, but it did not happen. What we're going to be looking at is the emergence of a British-American Civil War. That's how people understood this and what the outcome was going to be. Nobody knew. And I have up here in my lengthy notes, which I'll just quickly summarize. The dangers of presentism in history, as I summarized, is that you can't take what you know happened and read it backwards. In order to understand how people understood at the time what was happening, it's imperative that we look at it in terms of how they understood it. This was a war between British Americans, and as strange as it may sound, some revolutionaries, as they later became known as, were trying to reform the British Empire and make it better, and they had historical contexts and precedents for doing that. There are a number of factions that existed, as you well know. There are some people who are very strongly in favor of resistance to British policy. We end up knowing them as revolutionaries. And then there was another group of people who defended the prerogatives of Parliament to legislate. They became known as Loyalists, and they get a very bad rap, as I'll talk about. But there are a small number of people, the really truly committed resistance people, fairly small number of people. This will not shock you. The majority of British North Americans, where the term that was used in the 18th century was disaffected. They're just people that, I'm trying to get up every day and get by. I have a farm, I need to grow potatoes. I just want to do whatever is best for my family. I don't want anybody to get hurt. These are totally reasonable people who are politically moderate. And the people on the extremes of the politics are kind of, we've got to win the hearts and minds of the disaffected. So in 1775, that's actually what we're going to see, is people are trying to win the hearts and minds of the disaffected to say, we're the wave of the future, you need to get on our side. Here's an image of the First Continental Congress. 12 colonies were represented. And I mentioned that that was to coordinate resistance to the coercive acts. This is still in 1774. What they decided to do was pledge an association not to import or export goods back and forth to Britain, to put economic pressure on Britain to rescind those coercive acts. In order to do this, what Congress authorized was the setting up of committees of inspection that were often known as committees of correspondence, which you've probably heard of before, and committees of safety. And you've heard of them in passing, but these, I'm going to argue tonight, were some of the most important revolutionary bodies that were organized at the absolute local level. What they were designed to do was to go into the community and get people to either take the oath or not. And if you didn't take the oath to not associate, to buy British goods or to sell British goods, we're going to write your name down. We might publish it somewhere. For people who are disaffected, hey, I'm just trying to get by here, it kind of forces them to take a stand. If you want to get by, you might think about signing on to the oath. Some people refused, others signed on a little bit later. This is one of the most effective tools in the arsenal. We'll see it morph into the revolutionary committees of safety over the course of this year. This is a reproduction of the Articles of Association that they're asking Americans to sign on to, North Americans, British subjects. And I'm just going to very quickly, I don't want to give you a lot of British boring history. I hope there's no one from the UK here, so I don't mean to say that. But you do have to know a little bit about British history to really understand some of the politics that are going on here. You've probably heard these terms from the early modern period, the Whig faction and the Tory faction. In fact, in the movie, Abner Sanger describes Loyalists as Tories. You've probably heard that before. I just want to explain what that term means. There are a lot of subtle meanings to it. The bottom line, the most basic level, these are terms that were associated in British politics going back to the 17th century, not with formal political parties, but with people who tended to favor one view of the British Constitution of government or the other. Very generally, the term Tory is always associated with support for the prerogative of the king, that the king should be the most powerful branch in British balanced government. That's Tory politics. Now, there's a lot of subtleties to it in the 18th century that develop. Whig politics, Whig faction, is identified, and some of you probably know this, are identified with protecting the prerogatives of Parliament, particularly Commons, the representatives of the people. So some of you have read some of the primary sources. Early revolutionaries, they call themselves Whigs, which is interesting and ironic. They consistently call themselves Whigs. How many people have heard Loyalists called Tories? In the movie, that was a trap. I can tell you this, people who supported the British government hated being called Tories. They hated it. And they tried to turn it around, and they tried to call the Whigs rebels. We're the Whigs, you're the rebels. So we hear a lot about the American Revolution being shorthanded into, we didn't want a king, and that's why we fought the American Revolution. Everybody's heard that, right? Tried this king stuff, it doesn't work. It's way more complicated than that. So Just very briefly, the British Constitution is unwritten. It's a series of laws and traditions that have evolved over time. The British Constitution literally means the Constitution of Government. I can tell you what the British Constitution of Government was by this time period, what had emerged. And it had emerged from a civil war in England in the 1640s and 1650s, a revolution, and then the Glorious Revolution. This was sort of the constitutional settlement. The most powerful branch of British government at the time of the American Revolution was Parliament, in particular, the House of Commons. The reason Commons had so much power was because it had the sole right to originate bills of revenue. So while the king had a lot of executive powers, Commons reserved the right to fund it, the power of the purse. And that made Parliament and Commons in particular the most powerful branch. The tradition that emerges by the time of the American Revolution is that the king would pick cabinet members from people who were in Parliament. That's the ministry. And this is the period we now know the term prime minister. This is when it's emerging in the 18th century. A lot of people deny that the position even exists. It kind of just comes into being. It's a minister usually from the Treasury, whether the Exchequer or the First Lord of the Treasury, who leads the government. And that's not an accident, because the power of the purse was viewed as synonymous with the liberties of the people, because Commons was the only representative branch. Now, representation was not widespread. It was tiny. It was corrupt. But this is the constitutional settlement. The other thing that comes, the power of the monarch was extremely restricted in Britain in the 18th century. The last time a monarch ever dared to veto an act of parliament, 1708. So the king did not have a lot of official political powers in Great Britain in 1775. Now, what really caused the American Revolution, you're familiar with the Stamp Act and all these questions about the Townsend duties and the duties on tea. You hear it shorthanded in all kinds of different ways. Americans didn't want to pay their taxes. We fought a that wasn't true. People were willing to pay taxes. It wasn't an issue on paying taxes. The issue was, where is power located? The British government said power is located in British government, in Parliament, in the ministries, and the king in Parliament. The colonists said power is located in the king and the empire, and Parliament is part of that, but we don't have direct representatives in Commons. In places like New Hampshire, our direct representatives are in the Assembly. So it's a more federal union view of the British Empire, if you will, of divided sovereignty. That basically the colonial assemblies are like little mini parliaments. So the big objection wasn't that you were asking us to pay taxes, it was that Parliament imposed the taxes directly on us. So it wasn't the question of do we want to pay it, it was a question of power. Now, some British North Americans said Parliament had every right in the world to do this, that this was the way the British Constitution had evolved over time. And I will also point out at this point, there were 26 British American colonies, that's counting the Caribbean, in 1775. 13 of them seceded from the British Empire. 13 did not. So none of that has happened in 1775, and it won't happen until 1776. I'm sorry I have so much text, but I'll take a look at these political arguments. They were made by British North Americans. If you don't mind, take a quick look at these two quotes. Yeah, sure. The first one is, all Americans acknowledge their subjection to His Majesty. The power of the British legislature is encroaching on royal power. The second quote says, "The king is entrusted the direction and management of the great machine of government. He, therefore, is fittest to adjust the different wheels and to regulate their motions. The connection and harmony between Great Britain and us, North America, will be better preserved by the operation of the legal prerogatives of the crown than the exertion of an unlimited authority by Parliament." Now, I've already kind of led you in this direction. Do you want to guess, are these revolutionary arguments or loyalist arguments? That's exactly right. This is a complex situation. You see, from the loyalist perspective, revolutionary politics are starting to sound a little bit Tory. In the latest phases of the conflict, a lot of people who embraced this federal vision said, the king needs to exert their right. We get our charters from the king. The king needs to tell Parliament what to do. We need a stronger monarch. I will now show you who those people were that wrote that. Both of them helped develop the Constitution, which, by the way, the president has a lot of kingly powers that the king didn't have, like the power of veto. So this is why people who are loyalists resented being called Tories and not Whigs. This is a strange kind of argument in favor of a stronger monarch. And we'll see how that plays out. They're actually asking for the king to override Parliament. For people who believe in a strong British constitutional system, this is very, very disturbing to them. And this includes a lot of North Americans that are very uncomfortable with this articulation. Now, not all revolutionaries make that kind of royalist argument, but that language is definitely around. So by the beginning of 1775, to really telescope this into a short time frame, the situation is very tense. The colonies have vowed to resist commerce with Great Britain until they lift the coercive acts. And the British government itself sees we've got what appears to be something bigger than political violence or resistance on our hands. We have an insurgency. And this is the first phase of British strategy in the war. It's a misreading of the strategic situation. It actually makes things a lot worse, and that's why the war starts. The British government authorizes the British Army to engage in counterinsurgency, and that they're skilled in counterinsurgency. The idea is that certain incendiaries are making people all upset, and they're saying bad things about the British government, and we need to arrest them and also take away their means to resist us. They see it as completely localized in New England, which is a misreading of the situation, but they see it particularly in Massachusetts, in Boston. It needs to be quickly crushed. So the thinking is that there's a bunch of the descendants of fanatical Puritans. If they can just capture some of these ringleaders, the entire resistance movement will collapse. Here's their counterinsurgency strategy. We will seize arms and ammunition for the local militias that are housed at Concord. So this is why the British regulars are going out to confiscate that, to make sure that an armed insurrection does not take place. As was the case earlier in the empire, members of the militia showed up, contested the British. Nobody knew what this meant. They fought at Lexington, they continued on to Concord. The resistance movement knew exactly where they were, what they were doing. They removed everything. Contrary to popular belief, the British Army did its job. They destroyed the arms, the ammunition, and then they withdrew back into Boston. What they didn't count on was that the surrounding areas, including as far north as New Hampshire and Connecticut, local militias mustered in response to this because they saw it as an unwarranted threat, a tyrannical threat to the liberties of the people. They saw it as the outbreak of a war. In May, in this really difficult time, a Second Continental Congress convenes to basically create a strategy of what do we do now that armed hostilities have broken out. And this is a little ahistorical. That's the signing of the Declaration of Independence, but that was from that Second Continental Congress, which morphs into the Confederation Congress. This is the point where we need to stop. Nobody knows that this war is going to go on until 1783. Nobody knows what's coming next. People are unsure. What everybody does know is that hostilities have broken out. The British Army is seeing it as an insurgency. And the understanding is what we are experiencing now is a British Civil War. We're experiencing a British Civil War. This sounds weird because we know what happens. A lot of revolutionaries, here's what they were thinking about. They were thinking about the English Civil War in the 1640s and 50s. Some of you may know that in the English Civil War, two branches of government effectively went to war with each other: the king and Parliament. And initially, Parliament won. The king was executed for treason. England briefly became a republic. Parliament created its own professional army, and then the commanding officer of the professional army, the New Model Army, Oliver Cromwell, becomes Lord Protector of England, which is a quasi-dictatorship. So England has this weird period where they go from monarchy to republic, commonwealth, to dictatorship, and then in 1660, the monarchy is restored. What people are thinking about is this is going to be a war that's not going to be exactly the same, but it is analogous to it. What the people in the resistance are thinking is, we're going to reform the British Empire by defending liberty here. That British liberty will be reborn by what we're doing. So this sounds strange, but a lot of moderates envisioned this as a way to reform the British Empire. Some people were thinking beyond that, but they were very, very radical. So what does the Second Continental Congress do? Well, they call for that militia that's besieging the British Army in Boston to be nationalized. They create a Continental Army, which is analogous to the New Model Army. George Washington takes command of it. Oh, and here's the other interesting thing that they do. They authorize an invasion of the province of Quebec. Time to invade Canada. And in late 1775, we do that. Now, I've already explained the actual underlying reasons for that because Quebec had been expanded, but the revolutionaries do invade Canada in 1775. And here's a map of some of those expeditions. It takes a long time to pull this together. There's two prongs to it. Benedict Arnold crosses through the interior of Maine in winter, which is not a good idea. If you've ever been through that part of Maine, they run out of food. People are roasting their shoes, eating their shot pouches. They arrive at Quebec in December, as I'll come back to, very hungry and not in very good fighting shape. And then there's another column that goes up the Lake Champlain Valley and takes Montreal. For people who wonder why Canadians are a little bit concerned about the United States, if you go visit Canada in the St. Lawrence River Valley, all the forts are facing us. We'll do this again in the War of 1812. So this was another thing that Congress authorizes. So they're expanding the scope of the war. This is an aggressive offensive operation that's authorized. So that's the military situation. I'll just leave that go. You know a lot about the Lexington and Concord March and all that. The strange thing in New Hampshire, I'm going to bring it back to New Hampshire now, is New Hampshire still has a government while all this is going on. It has a royal governor. It has a provincial assembly. Governor Wentworth, who's the last royal governor of New Hampshire, has to figure out, what am I going to do? He's already dissolved the assembly because he's worried that they're going to take all these treasonous resolutions and association, take the oath of association. So he doesn't have a legislature to work with, and it is a very dicey time. Once he dissolves the assembly, this is kind of a revolutionary moment. What the revolutionaries do is they say, we're going to have elections for a provincial congress, just like the Continental Congress. So they run elections, and the towns all elect delegates to a provincial congress. That provincial congress doesn't meet in the capital, Portsmouth. It meets in Exeter. This is a really weird moment New Hampshire now has two governments. So which government are you going to answer to? Now, they're not an official government. It's a completely extra-legal body. And one of the people who rises to prominence, who becomes the president pro tem of this provincial Congress, is Mishak Weir. And I don't know if many of you are familiar with him. You might have seen some of the Weir papers. Keene State College has them. Mishak Weir is a towering figure in the history of New Hampshire. He's often called the first governor, but he was the president over the assembly. He wasn't a formal governor, but he was enormously powerful. Weir would convene a committee of safety when the provincial Congress wasn't in session to make executive decisions, and that becomes the statewide committee of safety in this period. And basically, they're creating kind of a quasi-independent state government on their own. When that provincial Congress isn't in session, here are the powers that the New Hampshire Committee of Safety has. All matters in terms of security of people's rights. They had all kinds of discretionary powers. I just want to stop for a minute. It's not a legitimate government. Remember, the governor's still there. He's like, what about me? What about the elected assembly? Briefly in May of 1775, Wentworth sees this as a crisis and said, I've got to reconvene the assembly to deal with this provincial Congress. He does. And this is the speech that he gives to them. And then he quickly dissolves them when he sees them making a lot of treasonous resolutions. But if you take a quick look at this, he ends it with, it is highly incumbent upon us in this time of general disquietude to manifest our loyalty and attachment to the best of sovereigns. So Wentworth is pretty shrewd. He's saying, oh, you still like the king? It's Parliament that's doing all these bad things. That doesn't work. He has to dissolve the assembly. So in the midst of this civil war, the British now try to come up with a way of getting the disaffected to come over to them in the Civil War. General Gage, who's in Boston, under siege from the Continental Army, passes a proclamation known as Gage's Proclamation, and it said anybody who took up arms and came down, who marched down from Keene or Gilsum or wherever they came from, you will be pardoned. There will be no treason charges against you if you put down your arms and take an oath of allegiance. And he calls it an unnatural rebellion, which is the language that a lot of revolutionaries used. And there were only two people who couldn't take advantage of this: John Hancock, Samuel Adams. And if you look at this other quote, this is the quintessential Loyalist formulation of the revolutionaries, a bunch of self-interested, power-hungry demagogues misleading the people. I'm not saying that's true, but that's how Gage is portraying them. And you can see he's calling them the infatuated multitudes who have long suffered themselves to be conducted by certain well-known incendiaries. Trying to solve this problem, Congress, we're going to go over Parliament's head and appeal to the king. You can't really read this all that well, but it begins, the greeting is most gracious sovereign. This is to George III. It's very flattering, and this is in the middle of a civil war. They're going to ask the king to intervene in the civil war on their behalf. Now, we're laughing at that because it seems like a ridiculous way to approach it, but for the people who had this royalist notion of revolutionary resistance, this could solve the Civil War in a minute. If the king says, hands off, this is between me and these colonies. Those of you who know British politics at this time, with George III, as you can imagine, he has no interest in doing that, and furthermore, has no power to do that. This would be an unprecedented breach. The so-called olive branch petition is rejected by the king. And that's that definitely is the beginning of the end. You might have noticed in the Declaration of Independence, and I know that I read it every day when I jump out of bed. I like to memorize it and think about it. If you actually look at the 39 grievances, well, who does the Declaration blame for the whole mess? The king. That's a big shift. The reason was they felt rejected by all of British government, and they laid it all on the king's doorstep. Once they did that, that was the break. That's symbolic of the break. Those of you who have done close readings of the Declaration of Independence, they can't even name Parliament. They say the king is combined with others, foreign to our jurisdiction, to deprive us of our liberty. So that is a big shift. Shortly thereafter, the failure of the Olive Branch petition, in August of 1775, Governor Wentworth is forced to flee the colony. He has no viable base to reestablish royal control. His family, the central parts of the royal government, including the council, were in imminent danger. They're evacuated on a British Navy warship. And other people have to make their way out. I use this one example of a customs collector at Portsmouth who is well known for his support for British government. He talks about how the committees would take him out of his house. They would plunder his house. And in early November of 1775, he and his family had to just secretly leave Portsmouth. They couldn't live there anymore. In his view, this is my home. I'm defending government, and you have pushed me out. And that same time that he leaves in November, the revolutionaries are becoming a little bit more coercive in their tactics, and they're starting to lean into the language of treason. We're not committing treason. It's the people who support British government that are guilty of treason. Some of you are familiar with John Sullivan, very famous Continental Army general from New Hampshire. He requests more ability to force Loyalists either out, arrest them, or get them to stop talking. Washington authorizes that. And he says you should seize every government official who doesn't agree with the new regime. You can imprison them, but this is a time of war, and we need to take care of this. The committees begin to go into operation and policing this. The committees of safety at the local level immediately begin to do this. So people are asked to sign oaths of allegiance, take a public oath. If you're a loyalist, you should renounce what you did before and embrace the new regime. I have a couple of examples of people and the experiences that they had in 1775. These are loyalists. William Start, who lived in Exeter, was arrested on hearsay. Somebody said he said something that wasn't conducive to the revolutionary regime. And I've reproduced his primary source here. He said, I was detained at Exeter, and I was expecting somebody to appear before me and tell me what I was being charged with. They never appeared. Nobody told him what he was charged with or why he was being detained. This is very intimidating to people. The idea that you could be arrested and detained indefinitely without a charge was really troubling. Samuel Hale, who was a Portsmouth lawyer, he was a loyalist, but he framed himself as somebody who was a moderate, somebody who was trying to solve the problem. And he said, my moderate conduct rendered me uncommonly obnoxious. And he was harassed by the committees, and his personal safety was at issue, and then he fled. A lot of people who wouldn't give in and say, you're right, I'm on your side, they had to leave. Now, these are people on the extremes, both sides. For ordinary disaffected people who are just trying to live their lives, and you get a visit from the committee and they say, it's time for you to swear into the association, obviously, you might start to, you know what, okay, fine. I just want to continue my life. This is very, very effective at the local level, these committees. Now, some people are not quite so pleasant as to sit and wait and ask what their charge is. I love to use this particular person, Breed Batchelor, who might be well known to some of you, was an infamous loyalist, although he tried to stay in Packersfield as long as he possibly could. He saw himself as a moderate, and this is modern Nelson. He was kind of a problem. The committee went to visit him, And he was a prominent person in the community. He actually flipped it around and intimidated the committee. They said, hey, we just want to ask you a few questions. And he said, well, you're all a bunch of prejudiced people. I'm not going to talk to you. But if you want to talk to my hogs, you can go into the barn and talk to them. He was a pretty strong-willed person, not a very pleasant person from what I can understand as well. So some people, there's different levels of resistance. Some people will make a big deal about it and say, I can't accept this. Most people will say, just, yeah, fine. This is where they make a lot of inroads. Now, I'd love to tell you what the rules were for the establishment of committees of safety, but they varied by towns. We don't know exactly. In some towns, there were elections. In other towns, there weren't. People were just appointed. If you're somebody who's loyalist, you're not going to vote in those elections. And you begin to make the argument, I'm not represented at all by these committees. I'm not represented by the provincial Congress. Loyalists see this as a tool of tyranny. But it's very effective, as I said. The disaffected, at this point, getting visits from the committee, this gets a lot of people to just simply say, it's not a deep commitment. Yes, okay, I'm with you. Now, this creates a lot of complications within families because you'll notice that all the people who were detained and questioned were men. And this has something to do with the legal status, particularly of married women, which I'll just briefly give a whole separate presentation on the experiences of women in 1775. The thought was, and this is based in English common law, when a woman got married, and this is an extreme law, the Dutch law, Roman law, it's not quite this extreme. The argument was when a woman gets married, she's civilly dead. Her identity is covered by her husband. All the money that she brings to the marriage, the property is controlled by the husband. Doesn't mean that she can't make wages, they're just not her own. But the big central thing was she cannot act independently. So women were deemed to be incapable of having political views. That was contradicted by reality. One of the most important revolutionaries in Boston was Mercy Otis Warren. The other slide that I typically have up, I don't have up for this, Phyllis Wheatley, the African poet, who was a big advocate for the American Revolution and was published. Everybody knew that. So it's a logical absurdity that women were incapable of political thought, but it was more of a legal concept, that whatever side your husband chose, you had to go with. Women had independent positions, and sometimes you can see them in some of the documents. And I've reproduced the Loyalist claim of Isabella Nevin. And she says, my husband and his family and our family had to leave America because of the actions of the revolutionaries. So she's kind of covered by her husband's identity. But I don't see this a lot in women's loyalist claims. She makes a lot of political statements about the revolutionaries, and I do see it. This is when you can see a lot of loyalist thinking in married women, and she called the whole thing the spirit of anarchy. This is basically the craziest thing I've ever seen. Other people take different ways. Breed Batchelor's wife, this is a little bit later, this is a few years later. When the state is confiscating loyalist estates, she petitions the state government to keep the family farmhouse, and she gets it. Interestingly, I won't make you read all of it, she says, I should not be punished because I'm innocent of the crimes that the person who should be protecting me has committed. She characterizes what her husband did, joining British forces, as a crime, which, by the way, is an independent political judgment that she made from her husband, and the revolutionary government gives her the house. As we're coming into the end of the year, 1775, there's a lot of uncertainty, but these local committees are pushing people in a particular direction. What really solidifies things, and this happens across the colonies as well, an event occurs in November of 1775, and in my previous talk, I talked about the legal background to this. I talked about the Somerset case and the future of African enslavement in the British Empire. There's a lot of questions about it. When the war begins, enslaved African people all across North America look at ways of ending their enslavement. And they typically go to the British government because there was this court case that seemed to indicate that the British government was open in particular cases to intervening in laws of enslavement. The governor of Massachusetts, General Thomas Gage, receives a group of enslaved Africans and they say, free us, and we will serve in the British military. He says no. The royal governor of Virginia in 1775, same thing. Group of enslaved Africans, we've been working on this for a long time, we're coming to you. Arm us, free us, and we will fight for the British cause. Dunmore says no. He says, I haven't been attacked. My authority is not under threat. By November, he's attacked. I won't make you read this whole proclamation. It's an emancipation proclamation that is uncannily similar to the war measure that Abraham Lincoln used, and Lincoln would have been familiar with Dunmore's proclamation. I won't make you read the whole thing, but it says, any servant or enslaved person whose labor or self is owned by a rebel will be freed in exchange for military service with the British government. Now, this is not an across-the-board British policy. In 1779, it will become an across-the-board British policy. It's just in Virginia, and it's just with Dunmore. Now, what does this have to do with New Hampshire, you may ask? And he outfits an entire regiment, which he calls the Ethiopian Regiment. These are reenactors reenacting the Ethiopian Regiment. They chose their motto and wore it in their sashes, which was liberty to the slaves. This was the most chilling image to enslavers. Even people who did not enslave other people were terrified of this. They were absolutely terrified. So terrified, I will tell you this, you don't know this, but Dunmore's proclamation is in the Declaration of Independence. It's one of the 39 grievances. It's coded. He has incited domestic insurrections amongst us. That's what that is. This creates unity in all kinds of places, including New Hampshire, where Africans will, in the middle of the war, free people of color and enslaved people will petition for an end to enslavement to the New Hampshire Revolutionary Government in 1779, Nero Brewster's petition. They table it. Word spreads. This creates unity. A lot of people are fearful of the consequences of this, and I finally found it in the New Hampshire Gazette. The first mention of it takes until late December of 1775 until there's an article in the New Hampshire Gazette. They talk about the proclamation, and the writer in the Gazette calls Lord Dunmore the most atrocious criminal who ever appeared in America. That article appears alongside an ad for a runaway enslaved person in Epping. So this is an immediate issue to people in New Hampshire. So the disaffected or on the fence, they see this as a significant issue. Oh, and then that invasion of Canada, since we're in December, it ends in complete catastrophe. Pro tip, if you're going to invade Canada, don't do it in December. It's not a good time to do it. They lay siege to Quebec. They want to replicate what General Wolfe had done in the French and Indian War. It is a catastrophe. The commanding army, General Richard Montgomery, is killed in action. Benedict Arnold takes the remnants of this army and retreats out of Canada. So those offensive operations did not go well. What I'll conclude with, and then leave some time for questions if you want. A lot of people on the revolutionary side even are starting to say, this is getting a little crazy. We're alarmed at the situation, and even responsible revolutionaries are starting to say, we can't just have people running around willy-nilly, arresting people, threatening them, plundering their houses. There's got to be some order. And nowhere is this better represented, I think, than in this town of Keene. This is from the Selectmen records from 1775. And it's got some mundane things. They're choosing their representatives for the provincial Congress in Exeter for that session. And then they're choosing people that they want to see enforcing the committees of inspection, the resolves of the Continental Congress. And again, I won't make you read all of this, but I'll shorten it up. They're saying, we've noticed something. There's no damn laws right now. We need laws. We need something that people can expect can be obeyed, that will give them some kind of charge or due process. And then they go a little bit further and they say, you know, this is critical of the revolutionaries, and they're revolutionaries. They say, some people under the flag of liberty have gone around prosecuting their personal beefs with their neighbors and said that this is a political issue. So the more things change, the more they stay exactly the same. And what Keene is calling for is we need to come up with a government that can create some laws and expect some obedience and some parameters of how people will understand that. And they're basically saying, we need appointed people. If people are going to be arrested, they need to be appointed by the Keene town. It can't just be a bunch of people. I've had a lot to drink. I'm coming to your house to make you sign this oath. And the other thing that they conclude with is this has to be done at every level. You have to control families. Families have to, patriarchs should control their entire families. We need to return to order. The revolutionaries are starting to sound very conservative. Let's get everything back under control. In the end of 1775, the Continental Congress takes a look at the situation, and they conclude very much the same thing. We can't keep going this way. We haven't reformed the British Empire. Chances of us being able to do that are pretty slim. Here's what Congress says. Individual provinces can look into coming up with something. Guess what the first province is that does come up with something? It's New Hampshire. In January of 1776, after 1775 is over, the 5th Provincial Congress approves a new constitution. They don't have a governor, it's not checks and balances, nothing like that, just a legislature and somebody presiding over it, who will be Mishak Weir. And when Congress is not in session, the State Committee of Safety will be empowered with enforcing civil, legal, and military codes, which they do. I will tell you this, Mishak Weir is very moderate in his application of the State's Committee of Safety. Effectively, this is a big moment. New Hampshire is the first province to secede from the British Empire. Others followed the example. And scholars have focused on the Declaration of Independence. Pauline Maier has made the argument that it's not really Congress that did it. It didn't happen at a national level. It happened at the local level, and it happened at the state level. And that pushed Congress, because it's much, much later that you get a National Declaration of Independence in July. The last depressing thing that I will leave you with, accompanying this, there's got to be a loyalty oath. Number one, it only applies to men. Men over 21. And as you can see on there, it's got exceptions. That's where we're headed in 1776. So the Civil War, this is convenient because New Hampshire's so early on it. It's just 1 year of Civil War, and then they've come up with the government. So that concludes the Civil War. I'd be happy to take any questions if anybody has any. Yes. Yeah.
People think of Bunker Hill as our part of the action. I was just asking about Keene's role in the Bunker Hill.
Yeah, no, definitely the Battle of Breeds Hill was a significant battle that people from New Hampshire had played a major role in. This is before Washington had taken command of the Continental Army, and the British were trying to break the siege in Boston, and they were trying to take the high ground on Breeds Hill. They had nothing but contempt for the militia. They did a frontal assault on it and took very heavy casualties. They took the hill, but with very heavy casualties. Yes, New Hampshire and other provincial militias from the local region, Connecticut, Massachusetts, were pretty well represented there. Yeah.
You've mentioned, notices in the local press and among the local politicians. I was wondering about people who had greater influence, whether they've appeared on the scene at this point. I'm thinking of Thomas Paine.
Oh, yeah.
When did these type of people start to have an influence on public thinking?
Well, Paine is a particularly interesting character. He's a latecomer on the scene. As you could see, Benjamin Franklin had been articulating a slightly different view of the British Constitution since the 1760s. He had been consistent with that. Washington had articulated that even around the same time. Thomas Paine did not come to North America until 1775. Paine, if you've read Common Sense, which undoubtedly you have, that is the most persuasive argument for independence that's ever framed. And it's published in January of 1776. The weird thing about Paine, most Americans want to reform the British Empire. If you've read Common Sense, he says the British Empire and Constitution is garbage. It needs to be thrown out. We don't need a monarch, which was not a message that you would think a lot of people like Franklin, indeed John Adams, hated it. The weird thing about Paine is he was English. His disgust with England was from his own experience. So with the specific question about Paine, he's a latecomer, although he wrote several published essays that people read. He wrote an essay opposing African enslavement, and he wrote a metaphorical essay on unhappy marriages, which is a thinly veiled political allegory. Yeah, but the arguments had been raging for a decade before the outbreak over the structure of the empire.
I grew up in southern Vermont, and we had local legend was there was a Tory cave in the town. And
There's a Tory cave in every town.
I was saying I grew up in southern Vermont, and we had a local legend that there was a Tory cave in the town. And the story was that the Loyalists were hiding there on their way to Canada because of local persecution from do you know anything about that?
I don't know anything about that particular cave, but that is a familiar story because a lot of Loyalists, do you know a particular year that was focused around? Because things actually got worse for Loyalists as we get in, especially when Burgoyne's army invades the region. 1777 is when a lot of that kind of stuff happens. Do you happen to know? I can tell you that there's with the case of Breed Batchelor, there's a cave that he hid in when finally the committee ran him out of his house, and he ended up joining Burgoyne's army as a captain in the Queen's Rangers, which was a Loyalist regiment. So this image of Loyalists literally being driven underground is a recurring trope, and it typically happens later than this period. What we're beginning to see is the harassment, and I know it sounds bad, but it's not quite as bad as it gets in that period. That's interesting because that's an underground railroad up to Canada. Yep.
How many militiamen did Keene send to Boston 250 years ago this month?
How many revolutionaries?
Militiamen.
Oh, militia. I don't know the exact number on that. 29? For the city of Keene, though. That's just Keene, right? Okay. Yep. Yeah. Yep. And Abner Sanger was one of them who, he was, honestly, if you read Abner Sanger's diary, and it's only 700 pages, so it's something that you could read right before you go to bed. He's disaffected. They call him a loyalist, but he's more disaffected. Yeah.
What's the nexus or connection between the French Revolution and the Committees of Public Safety
That's a good question.
The American Revolution, where we apparently had similar committees?
Yeah, that is a...
And I never heard of that until I heard your lecture.
Yeah.
American. I'm sure there are other similarities.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a really, really good question, because the Committee of Safety in the French Revolution is very well known, in fact, infamously well known for the kind of political violence that it prosecutes. A lot of early historians of the American Revolution are writing around the time of the French Revolution. Mercy Otis Warren writes a 2-volume history of the American Revolution, and they kind of take some liberties, the pro-revolutionaries, because they're consciously thinking, we want to write histories that contrast well with the French Revolution, where we're not quite as violent. And so they downplay the significance of the committees of safety. Part of it is because the records for the committees of safety are not as well available. We don't know as much. This is a book waiting to be written. In fact, T.H. Breen did write a book called American Patriots, American Insurgents, where he really focuses on the role of the committees. These are the people who actually did the groundwork to change everything. And part of it is we don't know much about it. People experience this. They talk, the Loyalists, oh my God, they talk about it all the time, but it's a kind of willful forgetting that we have, that the revolution was consensual, it was deeply contested, and these were the bodies that kind of enforced orthodoxy. Sure.
Thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. I was struck,
Thank you.
I was struck by the idea that the English Parliament had a lot of the power, and yet the Declaration of Independence focuses on the king.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if Jefferson was making a rhetorical move there, picking up on
Yes.
some resentment toward the idea of monarchy.
Yes.
Maybe Paine's arguments influenced him. I'm just curious why you think, you could say a word more about why he
Sure.
would frame it that way. Surely he
Yeah.
knew what you presented. So.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can tell you this, that Jefferson was one of those royalist revolutionaries in the late 1760s. He articulated that it's pretty much our only connection to the British Empire is the king, and he wrote a lot about how the king is too weak. You know, we have this, the king needs to exert more power. And it is a great question to see where did because he rhetorically devised this on purpose. How did he get to that? Jefferson's more open to Paine. John Adams, who's one of the principal authors of the Declaration, hated Thomas Paine. He hated common sense. He thought it was one of the worst things that he had ever read in his life. So Adams was not in favor of that. But you're reading it correctly. It was a rhetorical trope coming from the more sort of royalist revolutionaries saying, we're done with the British Empire. And that's the moment when you know the Civil War is over. Nobody wants to reform the British government in the empire or in North America anymore. When they symbolically say the king did this, the king did that, the king did this, that is done on purpose to say that we're completely severing. That's the separation.
Again, thank you for a very great talk. I have a question. Were any of the New Hampshire Loyalists able to ride out the rebellion, or were they all forced to flee?
That is a great question. It depends on what your definition of a loyalist is. The short answer to that question is, what's your guess? 80%. I've led you in the wrong direction. The people who we have the most records from are the people who left loyalist claims, who are trying to get compensation for the property they lost. So we hear from them quite a bit more. I can tell you this, statistically, the majority of loyalists remain amongst us. They still walk amongst us. Some people would renounce former positions and they would take the oath. The majority did. I can tell you this, New Hampshire we have counterfeiters and a lot of people who left to join the British Army, but in other areas of North America, like New Jersey, which has the most Revolutionary War battles, there is brutal civil war between North Americans, and the one state that has the most violent, horrible civil war is South Carolina. The overwhelming bulk of the Loyalists in South Carolina reintegrated. After the war was over, they said, we're willing to renounce everything we did so we can stay. And then South Carolina embarked on this willful enterprise let's forget that we ever had this horrible civil war amongst us. It's not really a problem. Many of you might have heard of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, which preserved Mount Vernon. Has anybody heard of that? Historicals? The founder of that organization was the daughter of a Loyalist.
Add something? One of the projects that we've been working on or started in the past year is to really look at who were considered loyalists.
Yep.
How many of them fought in the French and Indian War? How many signed the association tests or not? Did they have to flee? And so we're starting to look at each town in Cheshire County so that we can maybe see some patterns or are there anything interesting that we can learn from that. So we have some citizen archivists at work researching by town to grab some of those stories.
Yep. And the stories are different within towns. Like Abner Sanger, his brother joined the British Army, but Abner Sanger remained in Keene. He was arrested at some point, spent some time in jail, but as you know, if you go down to the cemetery on Washington Street, he's down there. He stayed in Keene.
Shopping was better.
Yeah.
This is just from a pragmatic perspective. How is our country finding out, or the states finding out about all of this? And the method of communication is like, how is that happening?
It happens pretty quickly. People assume that it takes a long time for people to hear anything, and there, in many cases, will be the lapse of a couple of weeks before you hear of a current event, which seems to us, in an era of smartphones and push notices, to be inconceivable. But in a short order, within the span of maybe, depending on how far, if it travels by up the coast, it could be less than a week to hear about something that's happening in Virginia. And I will say, the newspapers were incredibly sophisticated. There were networks of newspapers, and I didn't even get into it, but one of the things that happens in 1775 is the revolutionary printers basically put the Loyalist printers out of business. They have a lot of debates, and that debate gets kind of silenced. But the newspapers were a well-oiled machine. They had subscribers and delivery networks. And if you've ever read the New Hampshire Gazette from the 18th century, you'll see that it reproduces, it's like the Associated Press. They reproduce verbatim essays that appeared maybe in the Virginia Gazette. So all they need to do is get that, they run it, and the way that they printed it, it was just in one sheet. So the things that you could do in advance would be on one side, and then the things that come in at the last minute are on the inside. That's why you read news, old news from Europe on the front, and you read ads, runaway ads on the back, and in the middle is all the news that's going on. And what percentage of people could read? It depends on what area that you're talking about, how you break it down by gender. I can't give a precise number. The majority, well, in New England, literacy rates were higher than they were in other regions. I will say this, you don't have to be literate to get the newspaper. Common sense was heard. People would gather in taverns to talk, and there would be, all it takes is one person who reads, and they just read it. In fact, Paine was aware of this. Common sense was written not to be read. It was written to be heard. So, yeah, it actually, the blood of the slain cries out, 'tis time to part. I mean, you can't get that from the written page. So, yeah, social networking was built around reading newspapers. So even if you didn't read, you would have heard this.
There's currently several books out about the role of American Indians during this period. And this is brand new information for many of us. I think the earliest such publication is 1980, Forgotten Founders. But also Pennsylvania on the Border, the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, did a lot in the 70s. And then there's the fear of African insurrection. There are 4 million blacks here and 2 million whites by 1750, according to Hofstadter, Portrait of America. Do you have any thoughts about revising American history as it's written?
Yeah, well, actually, in my 1774 presentation that I gave, I talked about both of those issues specifically, indigenous people and Africans and how that figured into it, and I was only alluding to it here, and this is great because it gives me the opportunity to go into depth a little bit. When the war broke out in 1775, as I talked about in the 1774 talk, the acquisition of independent indigenous land was a major cause. Indigenous people had fought basically a revolutionary war to assure their own independence that the British called Pontiac's War. So North America was indigenous territory. It becomes, as we get into later years, I would be talking about indigenous people. Indigenous people's goal, when this happens, they take a look at it and they've got one goal. A lot of people will say, oh, indigenous people fought on different sides. No, they fought on the side of their nation. Catawbas ended up entering the war on the side of the revolutionaries. The bulk of indigenous people who entered the war were allied with the British, but they weren't British allies. Another way of looking at it is the British are allied to the Chickasaws and to the Mohawks. Essentially, in 1775, indigenous people read the situation accurately. They have a really strong understanding of the debates about divided sovereignty, and they want no parts of it. They absolutely want zero parts of it. They say, this is between you and your British father. Don't bother us with this. The British Empire, that works. Congress, yeah, that works. And then eventually that falls apart because one of the major motivations was to acquire indigenous land, and it becomes another revolutionary war for indigenous people to protect themselves. In terms of African-American participation, as I mentioned, with Dunmore's proclamation, this is just the beginning. There's a long tradition of African resistance, revolutionary resistance. This doesn't come from Dunmore. Africans had been engaging in revolutionary resistance. South Carolina is actually the only colony with an African majority, and they are terrified of insurrection. When this does become main British policy, where a lot of Africans are freeing themselves, Congress orders the Continental Army to take African-American volunteers, and South Carolina and Georgia, we're going to negotiate with the British if you force us to do that. So in short, the answer is yes. In 1775, until Dunmore's proclamation, it doesn't pop up. Indigenous people maintain their independence by staying clear of it.
Then just to reiterate, the 1774 presentation is now on our YouTube channel.
Good old YouTube. Absolutely.
Thanks.